All right, here we go. Today we have former presidential candidate, entrepreneur, and billionaire, Vivek Ramaswamy. Welcome to Vlad TV.
It's good to be on, man. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm great, man. Been a big fan of what you've been doing, for a while now. Appreciate you coming in today.
It's good to be here. It's funny. I'm kind of a throwback a little bit. I was just at the company that I founded, Roivant's 10-year anniversary. They're celebrating it this week, so I was just at the offices seeing folks there. I used to work not that far from here, where I am in New York, in your studio, and so anyway, it's good to be here.
Well, thank you for coming again. Well, this is your first time here. I want to start in the very, very beginning. So you were born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Yeah, absolutely.
And your parents are actually Indian immigrants.
That's right. They came to this country legally, the right way, through the front door. That's accurate.
Okay. So, do you actually speak the language yourself or no?
Speak the language meaning of my parents?
Correct.
Yeah, so actually the interesting is my parents speak multiple different languages, and I am fluent in one of them, called Tamil. So the native tongue of both my parents is a language called Tamil. I'm fluent in that, but when you say speak the language, the one that we mostly speak is English, but I am fluent in Tamil as well.
Well, I understand. Yeah, I didn't want to say the wrong one because I know there's multiple languages. I know English is the dominant language, but there's also other languages in India. That's why I said it that way.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. I mean, my parents came from India, but it's a religiously pluralistic country, and it's also a country with a lot of diverse geographies. It's big. It has diverse cuisines and cultural habits throughout the country, yet it resides under one country, a banner that was a much more recent democracy, and a lot of parallels to the United States as well. And so I think my parents, like so many other Indian immigrants who come to the United States, came here for a reason. But at the same time, there were some elements of it that were very different and some elements that were also deeply familiar. Now, I asked my dad, how on earth did you choose, of all places, to come to Cincinnati, Ohio? Because it is a pretty random decision to make, right? So my dad grew up in a village in Kerala, which is the state that's the southern tip of India. Very tropical, one of the most beautiful places scenically that you'll visit. But he used to take us there for summer breaks growing up. My mom, my brother, and I, we would all go. And we're talking like village depth village, right? We're sitting here in Manhattan right now in modern 2024. I couldn't think of a more opposite experience, right? It's a village. Your toilets don't exist to sit on. You squat on the ground. You take a bucket of water. You wash it off after you're done. You eat your meals on giant banana leaves. You don't actually drink the water. You boil the water twice, drink it. You take the hot water from the kitchen into the bathroom that has a well, mix that with cold water. There's your bath. That was how we spent a lot of our summer breaks, is in the house where my dad grew up, because he wanted us to have some knowledge of where he came from and where the family heritage came from, and also that there was more to life than just, being comfortable in a middle-class upbringing in the United States of America. But you know what? Things have changed there now too. So now you go back to that old village in India where my dad grew up, and it looks nothing like it does today. And I don't mean to be, morbid about this, but you go to certain parts of the United States of America, maybe even cities like this one, like New York City, and you see a lot more third world conditions than you did in third world countries in the 1990s. But a lot of that's influenced, anyway, my own thinking. And parents who came here halfway around the world, I said, why did he come to Cincinnati, Ohio? He actually had an older sister in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Cincinnati was the closest place my dad could find a job to be able to continue his education. That begged the question of why his older sister came halfway around the world from Kerala, India to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And our family joke, at least, is that it is the only U.S. state with the word India contained in the name of the state. So a lot of my relatives lived in Indiana and in Ohio and in Kentucky and Michigan. And that's where, actually, after I lived in New York City for years, I lived here for over a decade. Before we had kids, we decided to go back and raise our kids in the same environment that my wife and I both grew up in. She grew up in Michigan, I grew up in Cincinnati. And so we live in Columbus, Ohio today.
Okay, so you're growing up in Ohio, but you're actually spending your summers back in India.
That's when we were growing up, when we were in first, second, third grade. Certainly till about junior high school, because when you get to the 7th grade, you got stuff to do in kids and activities, and so it became less frequent. But back when I was in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, probably all the way through 5th or 6th grade, every summer, my dad would take half the summer, and we would go to this village in southern India where my dad grew up, and my mom's parents also lived not that far away. We'd visit our grandparents, visit our extended family members. It was a different world and a different upbringing that definitely gave me greater perspective and gratitude for, we weren't wealthy in the United States, but we weren't poor either. We were squarely middle class in Southwest Ohio to working parents, but it was a different world compared to the one that my dad exposed us to. And I think it was intentional that he wanted us to make sure that we were grateful for what we had here.
Well, you're growing up in Ohio, and at one point you go to Catholic school for high school.
Yep, that's right. St. Xavier in Cincinnati.
But your parents are Hindu, and you yourself are Hindu as well, right?
That's right.
Okay, was that a little strange, considering that religiously you're very different than what the school represents?
Well, it was different in some ways, and it was strange in some ways, but it was really familiar in other ways too. And so, go through my upbringing a little bit. That was not an intentional decision that my parents said, okay, you're going to go to a Catholic school. Although funny enough, my mom actually went to convent school, Christian school in India, and actually took a lot away from religious upbringing in a Christian school, even though she was raised in a Hindu household, actually in a country that's majority Hindu. Having gone through Christian schools, that also, I think, influenced her perspective a little bit on the good that can come from having religious education, even if it's not the actual faith that our family practices. But I started in public school. My parents could not afford private school with the responsibility of 2 kids. My parents, as I said, are solidly middle class, and we weren't poor, but they came to this country with no money. And so certainly when we were younger, they were still in the beginning of establishing savings and paying off debts and things like that, home loans and so on. So we ended up going to public schools 1st through 8th grade. The public school system I went to was interesting. It had annexed a number of different districts, including some adjacent districts in Cincinnati and greater Cincinnati that, were pretty rough. Let's just sort of be blunt about that. Many of the kids I went to junior high school with came from broken families. It was, I don't know if it was majority black, it was close to majority black, majority minority. A lot of the kids came from different household environments than I had honestly, the privilege of enjoying, right? 2 parents in the house with the focus on education. A lot of the kids in junior high school were bigger than I was because they were 2-3 years ahead. They'd been held back serially, often more than once over the course of their upbringing. There was a wing in the high school called the Success Wing. I remember that. And the Success Wing was the kind of place where they told kids like me not to go, right? Because there'd be risk of, bad things happening if academically oriented kid who is pursuing one path goes to the Success Wing, where there were kids who were struggling in a lot of different ways, but it wasn't uncommon for there to be fights in school, a lot of incidents. Actually, one time I was in 8th grade, I was going from science class to a different class carrying a stack of books. Just for the heck of it, a kid pushed me down a flight of stairs, much bigger, maybe had been held back for a couple of years. That had a big impact on my parents and a couple of teachers to my parents having a wake-up call to say, hey, listen, you might want to consider for high school sending your kids in a different direction. Mr. Wagner was my 8th grade French teacher, and I remember he took my parents aside and said, look, you need to really think about where your son goes to high school. And that's where my parents made some sacrifice. It wasn't easy for them. My dad faced layoffs at the GE plant in Evendale, Ohio, had faced those for 4 years. That's under Jack Welch. You know who Jack Welch is, by the way? He was
exactly who that is.
Kind of a legendary CEO of GE, but controversial because a lot of how he made GE's profits go up was just by slashing a lot of the workforce. 2/3 of the people in the area where my dad was working were laid off at one point. And so he ended up actually going to night school for 4 years just to keep his job security because GE had a shortage of patent attorneys and he was an engineer. So if he went to law school, which he did at night, which is ridiculous if you think about it, with 2 kids, wife was working full time. I mean, we've got a 2-parent working household as well with 2 kids. We have all the help in the world, including grandparents who live nearby, not halfway around the world, nannies and everything else to help us if we need. Even still, that would be an unthinkable idea to have a day job plus going to night school. Without any of that help, that's what my dad did for 4 years. And yet after working that hard over the course of us being in junior high school, they made the sacrifice of saying they're going to pay for me to be able to go to a private school and my brother to be able to do the same thing. And the best one that they could afford, there were some much more expensive private schools in Cincinnati, but the one that both was right for our needs, but also was affordable enough for my parents to be able to make work was St. Xavier High School, which happened to be a Christian high school, a Catholic high school. And so it was a topic of reflection for my parents. Is this going to be something that's a good fit or not? I have to say it's one of the best experiences that I had because it actually forced me to reflect more deeply on what my own faith was, what my own convictions were. I hope my classmates got something out of it too. The religion education at St. X was excellent. It actually was pretty thoughtful, pretty broad-minded. My peers probably learned a little bit more about a different faith from having gone to school with me, and I learned a heck of a lot more about Catholicism and Christianity that caused me to see, I think, a lot of overlap in the shared values, even while understanding certain differences in the theology. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. You're going to Mass. I remember in 9th grade, and they're singing different songs, and they're taking the Eucharist, and you're not sure whether you're supposed to sing along or not. Everybody else stands up at certain points. You're 14 years old. Am I supposed to be doing that? Or am I supposed to remind myself that, hey, I'm Hindu. That's not my religious tradition. I remember the feeling of everyone would go to the front to get the bread and the wine, right? The Eucharist at the end of Mass, and being uncertain whether I was supposed to participate in that or not. And there was a certain discomfort with that. But the school I went to is actually a Jesuit school. It's a Catholic school, but particularly it was a Jesuit school. And one of the things that the Jesuits taught, and which really landed well with me, is get comfortable with discomfort. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so it's interesting, right? Because if you think about that, even just the stuff, actually I haven't had a conversation like this in a while, so this is interesting reflection for me as well. But even if you just think about what we have just talked about right now, that was familiar to me, right? My dad would take us to India growing up because he wanted us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Right? It's not just the Western comforts that we would enjoy. Yeah, you'd get sick, but you deal with it. Yeah, you sit on the squat on the floor and eat off a banana leaf and you don't have a Western toilet to use and you don't have hot water necessarily unless you boil it on the kitchen stove and use it in the bathroom. Fine. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And the same thing with the public schools we went to as well, right? I went to school with kids who were very different than me in one way. It wasn't a Catholic school, obviously. It's a public school. But there were kids who came from a lot tougher backgrounds than I grew up in. I took something away from that, got comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then now I'm in a very different environment where I'm actually going to school with kids who did come from a lot wealthier backgrounds than I did, all of whom were almost uniformly Catholic. That makes sense. It's a Catholic school, but of a different faith and being different in a different kind of way. And so just if I think about those 3 chapters of my upbringing, it got me used to being the odd man out a little bit. My dad's saying when we grew up was, if you're going to stand out, he used to say, you might as well be outstanding. And, it became a little bit of a life philosophy to surround myself with people who were a little different than me, would challenge me a little bit. Just earlier today, before I came here, I told you I was with some of the other people I used to work with in the biotech world, which is a totally different world than the world of politics that I've been in. And the day before I was here in New York, I was, with a bunch of political folks. I was with Donald Trump in the courthouse downtown. But I've always been in different worlds than the world that I necessarily grew up in and had points of view. The CEO of the company that I founded, who's running it now, we were just sparring earlier today where he and I have different political views on a bunch of things. We had some fun, busted each other's balls a little bit. And then I came over here to have this podcast with you. And I think about the things that I'm doing now, in some ways, it was probably the product of an upbringing that had me be the odd man out and enjoy it and be surrounded by people who had backgrounds that were a little bit different from mine. And now as we're raising our own 2 kids, I think a lot about how we can maybe give them that same upbringing too. And it's funny because it's a little bit harder now. I founded multi-billion-dollar companies. Our kids are growing up in circumstances that we literally would have never imagined when I grew up in this country, which were themselves circumstances my parents would have never imagined when they came to this country as immigrants. And in some ways, it sounds odd to say, but actually it's harder actually to be a kid who's grown up in the circumstances that my kids are than it was for me, where we naturally had those different experiences in a way that, my older son's 4, my wife and I give a lot of thought to how we're going to give them that same type of eclectic experience rather than just being in a, upper class family that's lived the American dream already. How do we pass that on to our kids is one of the things that I think a lot about too.